Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and my guest today is Fazle Chowdhury, a distinguished writer and global affairs analyst known for his in-depth exploration of Ukrainian, Iranian, and post-communist affairs. A member of PEN America, his essays have been featured in a range of prominent European and international publications. He's the author of 11 fiction and nonfiction books, including the most recently published, Ukraine at Any Price, A War Against the West. It's so great to have you here, Fazle. I have been watching you work and do the things you do for some time. I got to meet you recently, which was an incredible experience, and I'm really excited to talk about something that's kind of a niche topic that has never been discussed on the podcast before today. So thank you so much for being here.
No, my pleasure, Beth. Thank you for having me.
You bet. So we're talking about a part of Pakistan that I feel like a lot of people, if you pay attention to Afghanistan, obviously Pakistan is very important. These regional dynamics, the fact that, actually that's what I would like you to start with. I was going to have you just break into the region you want to talk about. But for people who might not have background about Pakistan, can you talk about the border between the two countries, how it was made, and why it's kind of not heeded by many people on both sides of it, and what kind of that has created between the two countries?
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned that because, from very specifically answering your question, the borders of Pakistan, particularly on the eastern side, as well as on the west, was created by this guy named Cyril Ratcliffe. He was hired by the British government, British colonial government back in 1947, to create these lines. The only problem was he had never been in these areas. So he had created these borders, which, on the eastern side, which is basically bordering towards India, there are horror stories. If you speak to any Indian family, will say, particularly towards in Punjab and even towards Kashmir, where I think there's one famous story that I knew about, which is a family goes for lunch to visit a few relatives, and in the evening, as they're coming back, they're unable to go back to their home because there's a border patrol that says that you cannot go back to your home. And they're like, what do you mean? And it's like, well, these are the borders of the new state. Now this is, this is a very famous story. You can look it up. Almost every South Asian historian can tell you about it. On the Afghan side, on the Afghan Pakistan side, they are a little more complicated because you have a very complex relationship between the Afghanistan local tribal leaders and the British colonial administrators during the 47 exit, or I always say the 47 exit from India. But the Durand Line, which sometimes comes into conversations, and you'll hear about this, is it's a fictitious line that has been considered a border, but numerous Afghan governments, let me take that back. Afghan governments before 1980 used to consistently complain to the Pakistani authorities, saying that, this is not exactly an ideal border. I know the Brits have signed on it. You've agreed to it. That's fine, but this is not exactly something workable, because the main problem is you've got a large number of Pashtun tribes on the Pakistan side as well as on the Afghan side. So technically, it really doesn't work that way. My analogy to that is always like how the New Jersey-New York border is. Nobody gives a crap about it. They're crossing it. And equally, if you go to Pakistan, particularly on those sides, most people don't give a crap. But the problem is the conflict part of it comes in because of what you have in Balochistan. So Balochistan, as you know, it's a province, but it's split into Afghanistan has a slice of it, Pakistan has a slice of it, and Iran has a slice of it. and all three of these areas are really conflict infested. You know, these areas weren't so in conflict ridden areas in the pre 2001 era. Okay, yes, there were turbulence. Yes, there were a lot of drug cartels, but particularly in post 2001, it became kind of like this epicenter of, like, every single terrorist group had some sort of a corner in there as possible. Even now, you might have heard, particularly, I believe, the early part of this year, there were Iranian missiles that hit Pakistan side of Balochistan, and the Pakistan side of Balochistan fired missiles at the Iranian side of Balochistan, and then the two governments met together saying, like, I'm sorry, we can't go on like this. Our main targets are the terror groups that are operating over there. And it's true. But it is a very rich area. It is, filled with natural gas, oil deposits, but it's not developed. It is, if only a sensible government can go there and say that, all right, let's take the violence out, let's give the due dividends, and we'll begin construction and build an infrastructure, which would heed off so many problems that stem from terrorism in that area. But that is my extended answer to the border problem. Now, one thing I would like to add is that, so my experience in these border areas were particularly something that came as a shock because I was probably 15 at the time. And I saw them kind of like, imagine you are, thrust into this room and it's all dark and you're like, where do I go? Because the darkness is endless. And my experience with Afghanistan was similar to that. The first time I went to Peshawar, I remember I was in boarding school. I was dreading coming home because of the fact that I remember my dad saying that, please try to do well. I know your head is not exactly in school and books and, like, you might be doing other things, but, please try to do well, and I didn't. I was certainly not one of those guys that you would think that, at 15, he's studying long and hard hours in a boarding school, his dad is, like, very proud of him. No, my dad was not proud of me as a student. He is probably not proud of me now.
What?
But my point to you is that when I first went to Peshawar, it was like an alien country, I was in a boarding school in India, where it was very difficult to reach at the time. We're talking about in 1995. All right. So you take a 6-hour bus ride from the boarding school to the airport. From that airport, you go to a main city like Bombay, or that what was then Bombay. You spend 4 hours waiting for the next trip, which is to Karachi in Pakistan. Now, keep in mind, the customs in Bombay will always assume that you are some kind of an informant, even if you have an American passport. Okay. And for me, I got it on both sides. When I would travel from Bombay to Karachi or Karachi to Bombay, both sides would tell me that, oh my God, we need to search all your bags. We need to search whatever you're carrying. Get out all the luggage that you've, like, basically checked in, because we're going to take it out. Finally, it got to a point where I think by the time I graduated from high school, I was like, you know what? I'm going to carry all my stuff so that you can just, like, racket it out in front of me and, like, shove it up back like a sack by the time I'm leaving. But it didn't get like that, but it felt like that. But I remember so from Bombay to Karachi, the customs guys gave me crap. In Karachi, when I landed, of course, they gave me crap because the flight was from India. Both countries at that time were testing nuclear weapons, which would formally be endorsed by 1997 or 98, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. So anyway, there were tensions there. From Karachi, you would have to wait about 3-4 hours, and then you take a flight from Karachi to Islamabad. When you would get to Islamabad, you would wait for an hour in the plane. That same plane will go to Peshawar. Okay. Now, keep in mind, that plane is not one of those great planes where you feel as though the service is great and you'll be treated like a freaking actual customer. Okay. It's not. Okay, the meal is terrible. The glass of water, you are you wonder what's in there, but you drink it anyway because you're thirsty. And particularly for me at the time, I was like, I'm gonna get the wrath of my parents for bad grades, so what the hell, might as well go for it. Okay, all right. So, and then you land in a place like Peshawar, which is a very small airport. It is really cold at night, and you are not dressed for the cold, and you smell a lot of coal. And it's a great feeling if you're a smoker, which I was not. But for the other guys who would come out of the plane and they would take these deep, long breaths, and I would be like, "What are you enjoying?" Okay. But I remember it like and I remember stepping down, and my father had a driver who was from Afghanistan, who was from the Nimruz province, but he was the most kindest man I ever knew, and I remember him picking me up, and throughout the course of that winter, I remember developing a very special relationship with him, and even the numerous times between 95 to 90 mid 97 or towards the beginning of 98, I think. I when I used to do these trips back and forth between boarding school and to Peshawar, he was there. He would always pick me up, and going with him to places was particularly interesting because everywhere you went, they were armed. Everybody was armed. You go to the barber shop, somebody is armed. You go to the restaurant, somebody's armed. And there was this joke amongst those who could joke at the time, which was the fact that you're carrying tomatoes, but you don't know how to use the sausages. And this was said in the Dari language, okay. And, I got a little curious, and, sure enough, later on I understood what that meant. But one incident I remember specifically where we had two guards at the gate of our home, and the driver said one day jokingly, saying that if a rat came underneath the steel gate, you would be so scared that you would hide your guns and you would run for your life. And I thought that was kind of rude, and I was just like, really shouldn't insult these guys like that. It's like, and he said to me, trust me, if somebody came, they would not know how to use the gun. Well, 2 weeks later, somebody did break in, and I remember it was kind of a horrifying moment for me because, on one hand, I actually saw this live. The person breaks in through the gate, and he's got two other members through. And the guard is sleeping. And I know there was another person, and they were at the back. But once they came in, I realized I didn't have to do anything. I was just standing there watching. And there was a third guard that day, just happens to be, and he took out a huge water pipe, and he just sprayed it on them. And the tap, he basically got three taps rolled into one and just sprayed it. And those guys, funny enough, the assailants that came in with guns did not know how to use the guns. So you would think, like, if you see somebody who's going to spray water on you, you're going to, say, stop, I'm going to fire at you. They didn't even have time. They slipped, fell, one broke a hip, the other hit his head. The other one who was trying to get up, this guy, of course he was Pathan at the time, he tied him up with that rope, the same rope that he used to spray water on, okay? And I was just there watching, and it was just like this 15-minute episode, and I kept on thinking to myself, like, how dangerous can this place be if this is what happens? Now, if you go outside, I remember this very clearly, if you went outside, particularly in the downtown areas or the other residential areas in Peshawar, for someone who did not live there, did not have friends there, a teenager at the time, you know, you felt very safe. You felt extremely safe because the people around you gave you that kind of confidence that it was a very safe place. The only time I felt it was not safe was when my mother asked. Well, she was not a good driver, but she decided to drive that day, and we didn't have our driver that day itself, and she hit a Talib who was on a cycle but was armed, and hit him, and the guy fell. And I said, Mom, why don't you stay in the car? And he's like, no, stay in the car. He would not harm a woman. And I was like, okay. And I thought my mom would be wrong, but she wasn't. She was dead right. She got up. She apologized. The guy got up and was like, sorry, we took a different turn. you know. And I was shocked because I was just like, my immediate reaction was like, oh my God, he's gonna break into the front glass. He's gonna say something impeccably rude, and I'm gonna be kidnapped with my mother. But that didn't happen. And so I still remain confident that it was a safe area. Now, that all changed when, as an adult, in 2007 fall, I'd gone there. I'd originally not planned on going there. The whole idea was to go to Islamabad, be part of. I was an independent contractor at the time. I was trying to get a level of international assignment, particularly in Afghanistan/Pakistan around that time. And I had done pretty much like 4 days of presentations, and I said on the fifth day that, let me go back to see my old neighborhood. It would be wonderful to go. I was able to get a taxi to go up there, but when I did, the situation was completely different. The widespread area of no traffic in Peshawar from the 90s was no longer the case. I mean, there were crowds, there were cars, there were trucks, and every single time I would speak to someone in the local market or someone in a cabbie, they would say to me, these are all from people who've decided to come from Afghanistan. And I was like, well, Afghanistan's safe, right? It was like, not really. Which was a huge contrast because when I would be in New York or Washington D.C. and you read the newspaper, you read the TV, it felt like it was under control, but it wasn't. And you'd hear these, and particularly amongst contractors, you would hear about these stories about, okay, you're trying to create a solar panel. You're trying to create a solar panel for certain neighborhoods in outside of Kabul areas, rural areas, that were moderately safe. And you speak to local residents to say, okay, if we put solar power, then you would have cheap, affordable electricity, which would benefit every single way of life. And that success was not coming. It wasn't coming. And then even with people that I knew who were involved in infrastructure projects, and I would say, the basic way to develop any area is to develop agricultural produce. Strong agricultural produce, you work the land, you build it, you sell whatever you don't need, and it's a very equitable way of producing wealth, a little bit of wealth at least. That wasn't happening either. And every single time that these kind of questions would happen, and I would reach out to my friends and even colleagues, former colleagues, to say that, why is this? This is a very simple plan. And so, well, there are tribes that block off water to other tribes. And these vendettas go back centuries. You can't do anything. And even when and there used to be this thing I would always hear is that every single time a foreign invader would come, Afghans would unite. My version of it was that they never did unite. They would fight, not together, and they would go after the same enemy, but in ruthless to even more ruthless ways of response. And sometimes I would think particularly, and these voices inside of my mind particularly became much more louder once I saw the Obama administration create these kind of plans of, first I saw exits of NATO troops out, um, getting out of Afghanistan, and then, of course, there were contingents of American troops that were leaving, and I kept on thinking to myself that, okay, you don't have a solid Afghan police force that is monitoring this area. You don't have a strong Afghan army that can step in immediately in the event there's a conflict. So what is the plan here? Because it felt like that things weren't working, and it wasn't working for a very long time. And we've exhausted all innovation efforts. We've tried the diplomacy, we've tried the economics, we've tried the unity of external players to come in and speak and understand the landscape, brought in local partners, but the local partners after a while seem to be not truly engaged. And so, and I would speak to my contacts in Pakistan and say, like, how could this happen? Like, I remember in Peshawar we would have these very peaceful neighbors, very wonderful communities that just worked. And I remember a school teacher telling me, who was introduced to me by a good friend, said that what you don't seem to understand is that things haven't been working for a very long time. There was a small window when it could work, and that small window was in the very beginning. And that never materialized like the way how some Afghans who were influential could influence. And so it just basically dragged on. Um, I'm a
So
very
that was 2007, right? You're still talking in
that
2000.
was so.
Yeah.
This is 2009.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, this is 2009. 2007. My version was it was complete chaos. But I still felt I was still of the view that it was under control because there were projects going on. There were still projects like you go if you go to Kabul, and if you that area where the epicenter of Kabul, I forget the center place. Sherpur area, yeah,
Okay.
the Sherpur area of Kabul, where like totally every international engagement embassy player is involved. I felt that over time, from 2007, that was going to expand. It would expand until everything got kind of like into the running of a central government. Power in Kabul would expand, infrastructure projects would expand, linkages would expand, but no.
It's funny that you say that because when I think of 2009 and 2007 and 2008, I had such hope. I was just a naive college student, and I was looking at the PRT systems from, of course, the people writing about them were the government institutions that were propping them up and saying that they could make change, right? It wasn't anybody critical of them because I don't think they were well known enough by the media, really. And I think the people that they let in to cover them were probably friendly to the government, and I just had such a different view because I was on the outside and because of what I was looking at. I was such a huge proponent of all of that development work, and I thought it could really work. And obviously, I think your view is more accurate. But I remember thinking, you're slapping up these schools, right, with cruddy materials. They're not going to last. And so it was this dichotomy of like, I have such hope in the idea of what we're doing, but that the execution was poor and that it wouldn't last.
So it's an interesting viewpoint, and this is actually a good thing in my book in terms of what you discovered. I was also in the same same view that you're just throwing money at something that's going to resolve itself, that you think it's going to resolve itself. But one of the successes of that initiative was, or still is, this culture, this institution of women in Afghanistan that in the course of time did find a voice. One of the stories I remember reading about during the withdrawal was that the Taliban had banned women from working in several government areas, including the hospitals. And I think after 4 days, they realized nobody could operate these areas without those experts. And they had to bring in the women to do the work, but their way of working was limited. They could be there only at select hours. There were a lot of barriers around it. I remember that. I also remember that there was this case about a dentist who was first banned from operating or working, and then elements of the Taliban requested her to come back because these guys were having problems with their teeth. So, it was like, it goes to show that,
they are self-serving individuals, and now we don't see any of that I haven't heard any stories of select women being allowed to come back. It's like, oh, your husband can come in your stead and work your government job that you're trained to do, or just such dismissive nonsense from the Taliban. But I want to go back, because I know that one of the things, I want to talk about what changed in Peshawar between when you saw it as a teen to make it what you saw when you were there in 2007-8 period, because I think that's really important, and I think it's important because it's happening again today. And what is that going to mean for the future of Pakistan being on the border? All this instability, it hasn't ended. It's continuing. Right. So I'd like to ask you about that. Like, bring me back to those changes.
Yeah. So I think one of the incidences I can best reflect the change was, I remember 6 months before my grandmother died, my maternal grandmother died. She had given me money of very limited value, but it was not in US dollars, so I couldn't use it. And it was of a different currency. And I remember she was visiting Peshawar at the time, and she gave me that money before she left. And I asked our driver, I said, I don't know what to do with this. This is of no value. And he was like, oh, Baba, don't worry. We'll figure out a way. So we go to this market in Peshawar, and it is, I have never seen, well, at that time, I had never imagined such a place like that. When you've got foreign currency exchange, you go to a bank, nobody trusted the banks. There were all these money lenders, and it was really hilarious. Like, if you were to borrow, like, let's say something along the lines of $20, yes, you would borrow, but you would also give collateral. So the collateral was in the form of wheat or grain or different bags of, could be cigarettes, could be pens, could be any number of those. And I was just like, okay, how do you make an exchange for money that you have no idea what the value is? Okay. Incredibly enough, this guy that did the exchange for me, and he said, how much do you think it is worth? And I was like, to be honest with you, it's worth nothing. Okay, because I can't buy anything with it. He said, but it must be of some value because your grandmother gave this to you. And so I was fluent in Urdu, but my Dari was still very weak. He spoke to me in Urdu, and my driver helped with the translation. And he said to me, if this is something that was given to you by your grandmother, it's worth something. So let's do this. Why don't you tell me its actual value? Bring me something that is actually worth that I can buy from you. And then we can discuss the transaction. And I went back and I was just like, okay, this is nutso. I mean, like, what could I possibly think of? And so I came up with, if you remember those floppy disks, the
Oh
ones that
yeah.
we used to operate with, they were like this small,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I was like, I'm just gonna take one of these because that's I really think it's worth. So I go to him and I say, I really think this is how much it's worth. Okay. And so I gave him the disc and I said, you know what? I'll tell you what. And he looked at it and he was like, and he gave me the disc back and he said, I'm ashamed of you. You're a boy of no honor that you value the gift your grandmother gave is worth so little. And he told the driver, I don't want to do, basically he didn't want to do business with me. All right.
Wow.
No, bottom line. But when we were driving back, and I asked the driver, like, why would he say such a thing? And he said, Baba, people here value honor more. If you said it was her memory that was worth, maybe he would have done business with you, but they live by this code of honor. Okay.
Wow.
And but I was just like, so they've been doing this for like how long? It's like, well, once the Soviets invaded, a large segment of this population from Afghanistan moved here. Okay. And before, and during the time of the Soviets, there were a lot of these journalists who were coming and a lot of other elements that were kind of crossing within these border areas. They built a practice of exchange. So money lending became kind of like the basis of working. Now, fast forward 2007. Okay. You did not see any of these guys, man. They were pretty much embedded in the local banking networks, the kind of like just the community of merchants over there. Okay. I mean, if Peshawar back then, if you went, there was no. A, it was very busy. B, it wasn't like in 96 or 97 where you can roam around freely to the point where you'd be like, oh, goodness me, let me enjoy the sights, let me enjoy the weather. No. It was very busy, very dense, very, very difficult to maneuver around. I mean, they say you can never go back home again, because your home sometimes changes so much to the point that you can't recognize it. When I look back, Peshawar was, it wasn't my home. I was in a foreign country. I was in a foreign city. But there was a certain kind of an element of peace you enjoyed, But in 2007, when I went, I could not find it peaceful at all. The people that I reached out to, who I'd known through, not from my time when I was there, but through other channels, all of them said, like, I mean, we're here, but we have to monitor here through basically what's happening and going into Afghanistan. That was the nature of their work. It was the nature of their engagement in Pakistan at the time. And I would say, like, but, why aren't you in Kabul then? And you said the same reason why most aid agencies are in Peshawar, because they want to make sure that the transport comes here well, and it's transported through a group of convoys, not just one. Because, as you know, and Peshawar, if I remember correctly, it was only 30 minutes away from Kabul. So you can get there pretty fast, but it was still a difficult journey.
That's the most interesting part to me of all of this. I mean, that's where the Taliban were hiding out, right? It's so close to Afghanistan, but with the safety of Pakistan. And
But this is the weirdest thing. so so my father was a UN diplomat. He worked for the World Food Program. And the World
Okay.
Food Program in the 1990s was basically supplying food aid to Afghanistan. Only food. Okay. I mean, it got so bad, like, I remember, like, we'd have guests over and they would talk about wheat, flour, eggs, bread. Like, for like a teenager, like, you every Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights, you're hearing about people talking about just food items, and you're thinking to yourself, like, God, there must be more to your lives than talking about food items. I mean, I understand we eat 3 times a day, but like, surely. And keep in mind, in Peshawar, if you went out, you would not eat all the things that we discussed. You would eat bread and meat. That's it. Okay, grilled meat. Okay, and funny enough, I enjoyed it every single time I did. I mean, I'm a creature of habit, and every single time I had it, I was like, "Oh my God, I love this! I missed it," but I had my fill. But but the difference here is that it wasn't just limited to food rations. It wasn't just food transports. I saw tons of military convoys when I was there. The plane that would usually go from Islamabad to Peshawar uh, in the 90s were often filled with some military personnel, but the vast majority were Air Force officers. Okay, because Peshawar, I think, had a very large Air Force base, which was really not used well. You saw it; it was just like a bunch of cargo planes. That was it. But in 2007, 2008, that airport was not quiet. It was busy. It was like, I remember, like, I did not have that big of a luggage, but when I saw the people who were carrying, I mean, you'd see guys carrying huge amounts of bags, which I could not understand. I mean, like, I mean, if they had to go Kabul, they surely could have flown there. But if they were carrying this much stuff, it just meant the fact that they were selling things, perhaps, in addition to carrying their clothes in Peshawar. I mean, Peshawar was never really kind of like an economic hub. Yes, there was some trade, and there was I knew there were parts of the city that was not safe in the 1990s, but it wasn't that unsafe to the point that it made news all around the city. You know, there was stadium, and even like the people who roamed around there. I don't remember people wearing burqas. I don't remember men covering their heads. Even I remember once I had a virus in my desktop, and a lady showed up at our door, and she wasn't covered, and I said, "You must have the wrong address," and she was like, "No, I'm here to fix the desktop," and I was like, "Oh, please go ahead," and and I asked her how did you figure out the problem, and she showed me exactly. She would put in a dummy disk and she'd figure out, like, what's going on. She'd save. It's like, you caught a virus through some website that you were looking at. I was like, you do understand I'm not allowed to see porn. And he was like, no, 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 the other website that worms come in without porn, so don't worry. That is not the main cause. Okay. Um, and even I knew a dentist from Kabul who used to come to Peshawar quite often. She had her own practice, and but um, I asked her once. I was like, when you're in Kabul, like, is it safe? And she would say, no, it's not safe, but it's my home. Um, but the people that you now meet um, are pretty much not the version of the 90s. It's the version of 2007 and 8 who are basically, I think, A, there's a large refugee population. B, the refugee population increased, I think, in post 2009 onwards, purely because of family links, I think. Those who also had family links in other areas, in Tajikistan, um, and even in pockets of Iran. Iran actually, I think, for a long time did not allow Afghan refugees in. They did allow some, but that was only at the behest of some of the power bases in Herat, I think, because as you know, Herat has a very whoever controls Herat has a very strong link with the powers in Tehran.
Sure.
Although that dynamic too has changed, because I remember Ismail Khan, who balanced his relationship equally with Tehran and Washington as well as Islamabad very well. When he fell, when his authority fell, I grew concerned because Herat is a very unusual province within the Afghanistan umbrella, because it's historically very Afghan, but very Persian influenced. And for centuries, Persian traders have gone in and out of there without any hesitations. Similarly, like Peshawar, Afghan traders have come into Peshawar for centuries and without any trouble. But now it kind of gave me the feeling that this is a new climate, a new authority. But for the life of me, I do not think that history can just change in 1 minute. Powers can't change just like that. Yes, it's a new turn, but it will take time to be completely pro-Taliban, because even under the Taliban, I don't think Herat was really under their umbrella. Now it is, which is shocking. But going back to your question, the refugee problem, or actually the refugee integration in Peshawar is much more fluent than it was in the rest of Pakistan. And I think authorities, particularly Pakistani authorities who take that step to expel Afghan refugees, I think they've always had difficulties. If they started out in Peshawar, they would have to start somewhere outside of there to begin that process, because the city, whether they accept it or not, has a very distinct Afghan identity. And you can't just remove it just by expelling 5,000, 6,000 Afghans. It just simply cannot work like that,
That's so interesting. And what does that mean now for all of these refugees who are there? I mean, how is that going to impact the future of Afghanistan and the future of Pakistan? And, are the Taliban still, to your knowledge, keeping their homes in the area and trying to exert influence there, especially considering that, we know that members of the, NDS and ANA and other influential people are likely trying to hide out in that precise area. So, if it's a mini Afghanistan basically over there, what does that mean? What does it look like?
It's hard to define it exactly as kind of like, I wouldn't call it a safe haven because it's been like, I remember that I used to ask this question all the time to the people around me when I was in Peshawar, was that, all these people that are carrying guns, okay, and keep in mind, when I spent time in the United States and I would hear about stories about, school shootings and that was the first thing that came to my mind. I was like, any one of these guys can go into a market and just start firing, okay. And I remember the one thing that kept me always thinking and almost very safe was the fact that I would always hear that men here have a code of honor. They have a code of honor that when they hurt someone, they hurt a fellow brother, they hurt a fellow Muslim. But the alarm part of me was like, well, if it's not a fellow Afghan, if it's not a fellow Muslim, then this is where the problem can start. Now, I personally think that just based on my knowledge on that area, that, you know, violence can happen, but violence cannot happen in those areas. Now, Peshawar did see its own version of violence, if you remember back in, I think, even in the end of 2007, there were some heavy fighting, but it was within the province, it was not in the city, but there were fighting between Pakistan security forces and Afghan Taliban that was in there. And it had lasted up to a point until a ceasefire was agreed. Okay. And I don't think violence will happen like that again because, you know, it took a lot. I mean, keep in mind, like, you know, the moment we entered Afghanistan, the first country that felt it was Pakistan. You know, from 2005 to 2015, I mean, there was not a single safe news that I heard that somebody was not shot, somebody was not killed, particularly with problems that were coming from Pakistan. Now, these issues have subsided. You know, from 2015, you've seen, you know, the Pakistan Army going on the front foot. They've taken accountability of areas. They've had new generals, and they've toughened their stance. And now I think they're much more equipped to handle these kind of problems. But those kind of problems will not come now. I think the main problem lies in the direction in how much we make that decision in Washington and how much another power, primarily Beijing, sees that. Because Beijing right now is, I think, signed the only trade deal with the Taliban government. If you look at it in terms of peaceful terms and not violence, it has brought some peace. And I don't know about stability. I say peace and stability in two different forms because of the fact that stability means that you will actually have a population that can grow from this. You know, they will enjoy the fruits of it. They will be able to find their own voice, their own way of life. It's very difficult to say how that will pan out, you know. But what I do understand is that any kind of trouble that starts in Kabul will ignite in Peshawar, just like that. It's like a domino effect. Now, the Pakistan state is very good at containing that problem, but that doesn't mean the problem will go away.
Interesting. I wanted to gauge your thoughts because, you know, between your new book on Ukraine, all of our talk about this very porous border and these intertwined conflicts, the spilling out of conflict in Afghanistan that obviously has been happening for so long, Iran's proximity, and Iran is causing so much trouble now through its proxies. Mm-hmm. And I just want to get your thoughts about either, you know, there are those who say Afghanistan was the first domino, right? Not just that what happens in Kabul has these effects in Peshawar, but also that Ukraine, that the conflict in Israel, all of these things have been spawned by America's weakness. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of say yay or nay to that and talk about your Ukraine thoughts, because it's something that I certainly haven't been able to follow very closely. And I just want to know from somebody who has looked at that really closely, how are all these things related, or are they not, and what should we be looking at right now as a country?
So
it's a very easy question. Very sorry. I'm just going to make a little editorial. Very simple question to cap things off here. Just tell me about the world.
So I firmly believe that if we had done a better job with AUKUS, the contract with France and Australia, then we would not have this kind of a situation. So If you remember, this was based on a submarine contract that we had signed up with the French. But then at the last minute, actually the Australians signed up with the French, and then on the last minute we gave a better deal to the Australians, and the French were pissed off because of the fact that how dare we go behind their back and win such a great trade deal, and Paris pulled two ambassadors from Canberra and Washington, D.C., and then sent them right back after the weekend was over because they needed good relations with the United States as well as Australia. Now, what does that mean? It means that there's a crack between the relationship in Brussels, Berlin, Paris, and Washington. Now, had the Afghan withdrawal gone well in terms of cooperation with our European partners, yes, it would have still been chaotic, but we would have more friends than we do now, particularly in Europe. Why is that important? It's important because I think that if we had done a good job in the withdrawal of Afghanistan, I don't think Russian troops would have invaded Ukraine in February 2022. And I think one of their successes has been consolidating the richest real estate of Ukraine, mainly because of the fact that there are differences between Paris, Berlin, and Washington. But Ukraine is the victim of all of this because it wants to have its own sovereign country. It also wants to enjoy the fruits of the profits that it has through gas terminals, oil wells, which at present is occupied by the Russian forces. And it will not have those benefits as long as Russian troops occupy the richest real estate of Ukraine. Now, President Putin understands this, he knows this, and he also understands that there are cracks within Europe, besides Washington, besides Berlin and Paris, where some European countries enjoyed the arrangement between Russian gas flowing into their economies, keeping it alive, keeping it prosperous, and keeping their governments intact to do business with everyone else. And now that you've had several layers of sanctions on Russian gas, Russian money, Russian businesses, this is very difficult to do. Now, Ukraine and Afghanistan, how are they connected? So I've tried to tell you that in this complicated explanation, but let me try to make this a little more simple. Not many people know this, but 3,000 Ukrainians died in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. There are a number of Ukrainians who remained in Afghanistan because they could not afford to go back. Wow. Okay. There's also another story behind this, which is the fact that in post-Soviet invasion and in post-2001, Afghanistan was actually more peaceful than the border towns of Ukraine with Russia. Now, all that has changed now. And what does that mean in terms of Washington's position and Beijing's position on either Ukraine or Afghanistan? Ukraine is different because of one particular reason, is that I think the lessons of Afghanistan, if used correctly, will be very beneficial to Ukraine. the wrong lessons of Afghanistan will, of course, cause the inevitable demise of the government of Zelensky. But when it comes to Kabul, I will never forget this one moment when I asked this retired State Department diplomat, and he is not just wonderful, but he's worldly, he's knowledgeable, he's witty, he's everything that I would imagine an American diplomat to be. And he said to me, at the end of the day, after 20 years, if you can't get a single American to understand how much Kabul is worth, what does it bring to us? What makes you so sure that political leaders in Congress or in any corners of any state think it is worth anything? And I said to him, Kabul's real value is not in oil deposits or gas deposits, although Afghanistan does have that. Kabul's worth is really 20 years of that American experience. It's the population. It's the ability to understand a way of how supply chains work. American supply chains work. American leadership works. American workflow processes work to get things done. That's where the value comes in. And he said, and I will never forget this moment, and he said, sometimes even success, minimal, is not enough. And you know, I'm a dreamer. You know, I'd like to see the example of Vietnam becoming alive. You know, Vietnam, when we left, was a shattered place. You look at Vietnam today, you know, it is not a country that harbors hate for Americans. It has won the peace, and it shares that peace with Americans. I fear that Afghanistan, in the future, in the process of peace, their version of peace, which is very different from our definition of peace, will not be shared by the likes of not just Americans of today, but future generations.
Yeah. It's highly concerning. And it is important. We are very short-sighted in not recognizing all the things you said. You know, the value we put in, those years we put in, the lessons that we tried to apply from Vietnam. You know, the PRT system came directly from the Cord system in Vietnam. Like, it's a lot of these things we attempted. And I just think about all the veterans who gave so much of themselves there, who feel so connected to the country, and now feel that no one even wants to stand up and say, we messed up and it wasn't your fault. There's just so much. Like, we are tied to that country. And if we fail to see how important that is for us and for the world at large, then we can't see past our, you know, it's like, what are...
Yeah, I mean, I think about that. But I think what breaks my heart the most is the fact that during the pandemic, I remember I taught at a university in Washington, and we used to have these online classes, and there were students from Afghanistan who were logging in. And I would ask them, what time is it there? I said, oh, it's 3 a.m. I was like, you stayed up that late? You know, why bother? And it's like, no, just want to do it. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I was like, is the, like, Kabul University still something like, I remember my grandfather would be like, "Oh my God, Kabul University." Oh, and he'd like, there would be star in his eyes when he'd speak about that. Now, keep in mind, that was the reputation it had in the 70s. Okay. I don't know about the case today, but when I would say that to him, it's like, no, no, no. I want to take this class. I want to take this class because I want to understand strategies. I want to understand supply management. I want to understand business. I think about those people, and I'm pretty sure they're still there. They're still trying to build a life for themselves after all of this. And this is the weirdest thing about Afghanistan, and you will see this in Peshawar as well. So the British fought 3 wars against Afghan tribes, and there were numerous other kind of skirmishes against them. And each time they would come back beaten up, and they would kind of like reinforce their strategy to say that, okay, if one tactic didn't work, we're going to move like a second and third layer. So basically you would have like a 5 row battalions with like shotguns. So the first row will die, the second will take on, third, and on and on. And none of that was successful, but they kept on doing it again and again. And I tried to understand the Afghan perspective. And the Afghan perspective is really not about winning the war. And this is what makes it very difficult to understand this, because when we think about winning, we have metrics, we have data, we equate that as a success. In this culture, this Pashtun culture, success is not the win. Success is honor. And if you win with honor, that is the greatest thing anyone can aspire to live with. I remember speaking to an Afghan official who said to me that if I am good at what I do and I'm able to win the respect of my children and my wife, I think I can die as a happy man, even if the Taliban come back. And so, because this is such a different way of understanding success, and we've not come to terms with it. After 20 years in Afghanistan, I think that we focused on a very centric model, which was that we would empower our government in Kabul and they would do what was necessary to do all the things that a country in the 21st century does to function. And we kind of like limited to that. We forgot about the other provinces that were not doing well, the other provinces where starvation was apparent, the many provinces where one member of the family was a contractor to the U.S. Army and another was working for the Taliban. We did not fix these problems. And it grew and it magnified in ways where I think the chief casualty was all the people who put their heart and soul in building Afghanistan. There's not a single moment when I speak to veterans or even officials who tell me no different from what I've just said to you, which is that I mean, it goes back to this. So the British used to have these spies in the 17th century. The 18th century, and they would go in, and they wouldn't do anything. They would just go in to pockets of towns of Afghanistan, and they would just wander around, roam around, and they wrote these fantastic novels. If you go to any British town, you will find these small pamphlets of writings of foreign lands, and sometimes it's actually there's a tag that says that this is based on Afghanistan. a British commander who served in Afghanistan told me about this. It said that, we spent spent a century of sending spies and getting them to understand this culture, and they all came back with one thing: understanding their code of honor. And we still could not comprehend that. Now, for someone like myself, yes, I'm South Asian. Yes, I spent a long time of my childhood in South Asia as well as Europe, and New York, California. I am, to your definition, a third culture kid. Okay, that's it. And the American schools that I went to, the guys that were in my classes, two of them served in Afghanistan with Denmark, with a limited number of troops in Denmark. I didn't get a chance to speak to them when they were there, but I did get a chance to reach out to them once they came back home. I myself can't still understand where we went wrong, because there are so many things we could have done, and I'm pretty sure we touched upon a lot of them. We just did not go all the way.
Yeah, I agree with that assessment. And I was ever hopeful that we were going to find the right combination until I lost that hope and I couldn't watch anymore. It was just too heartbreaking, And I have hope that that something will happen, that there will be something that brings stability and not just a temporary break for all these, because I've met many Afghans virtually who, just like you described, they put their heart and soul into learning. They don't care if they have to stay up until 3 a.m. to talk to you, because it's worth it to them. And they long for this future that is not the one that they're the present that they're experiencing right now. So I want to turn it over to you. If you have any closing words, it is all your floor right now. And
No, I mean, I think we touched on almost everything. I don't think that, I never thought Afghanistan would have a sad story. It would have intervals of tragedy, intervals of things going wrong. Because I've met those people who said to me that when they traveled to Afghanistan in the 60s and the 70s, even 80s, that you go to places and you hear sounds of violence, but you also go to places and you don't hear anything. And that's considered peaceful. And a lot of it, I suspect, is because of the way how Afghanistan, the geography it is. There's this famous quote. Ahmed Rashid said it very nicely. Is that when God was creating this earth, he found these piles of items that he did not want to include in other parts of the world, and he just had it cornered off. And then once the world was made, he had to figure out a way how to get rid of them, and he just threw it, and the pinnacles and parts of it became what is Afghanistan, because it is a land of 23,000 empires. It is a land that is covered with mountains, difficult mountains, hard terrains. But anybody who goes there, will tell you, it's intoxicating. You cannot not love the beauty. You cannot not appreciate even those guys who carry guns and have a smile on their face. I always thought that as long as you had the women's movement in Afghanistan that was educated, that was resourceful, that was very much had a voice that was independent. It didn't matter to me if it was communist, Marxist, liberal, left, right, as long as they had an independent voice of their own, which they do. That cannot be wiped out. I know that for a fact based on what you and I discussed, is that there are enough educated women where the country cannot afford to have them sit on the sidelines. They will have to contribute some way or another. They are needed. They have the kind of knowledge others don't. Since that is alive, since that is still functioning, I still think that that is the center of the hope, and it can only grow, because because I'm I'm very, actually, I know for a fact that there will come a time, and I'm pretty sure the Chinese will demand it, once this experiment and this adventure in Afghanistan what we've basically done is that we've laid the groundwork for China to enter. Now they've entered, and now they're going to expand. But to expand that, they can't do it all alone. Okay. They can bring resources from any parts of the world, which is very much to their disposal. But at some point in time, they're going to want to do the same thing what you and I discussed, is that they're going to need Afghan professionals. Okay. Because they're going to have to sell it to the Afghans in some way, shape, or form. But that's why I'm hopeful. That's why I believe that the country still has a future.
I like that. And I think I'm going to glom onto that in the future when I need hope too. I definitely, Afghan women are a strong and resilient breed, and I applaud them for finding that hope in this time. And I really do hope that, I've been looking at China's involvement in Afghanistan with much concern, but that you make a very valid point, that it could also push things forward in different ways. And I hope you're correct. And I just want to thank you, Fazle, for being here, for talking about all these really high-level topics, and from personal points of view. It was a very balanced discussion, so thank you for joining me tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Beth.
To all of the listeners, I just want to say thanks to for sharing your time, for supporting the people of Afghanistan, for having the hope that made you come listen, and for the future, be sure to be following the YouTube page, enabling notifications, getting all those good spam notifications of all the new episodes. And until next time, Tasha Kaur, and hope to see you soon.